In addition to the changing landscape, I think it's important to highlight 4 key challenges this country faces and continues to face, but of course this is exacerbated by the lack of oil revenue. Of course, there is the political challenge, which relates very much to the continuing instability in North-South relations, that the fact that both countries continue their allegations that the other side is supporting rebel movements, attempting to destabilize the situation in either country. Then you have, of course, in South Sudan, the problem of domestic insecurity, which is related especially to 2 elements. One is the tradition of cattle rustling, which is a century-old custom of basically stealing cattle from other communities, even within the same tribe, by using cows as a way of and means of paying for a bride price. And if people don't have enough cows or money, they just go to other communities and steal them. Now, the proliferation of arms because of the civil war for so many decades implied, unfortunately, an incredible proliferation of arms throughout the country. So these cattle rustling events turn increasingly violent, and there's a vicious cycle of revenge, of course. And the lack of customary means of compensating for instance, killing someone through blood compensation led to a cycle of revenge, which unfortunately becomes many areas difficult to control. But that is traditional, and that will over time, hopefully through education and through other means of becoming more mainstream in economic activities and making the cows also an economic asset, not just a social asset of status and rights, but also an economic asset where you can produce milk and sell it on the market, or where you can produce meat and sell it on the market and export it to other provinces and other countries. That will basically shift then the mindset. But the other problem, of course, of domestic insecurity are militias, and there's one right now, the Yao Yao militia. It's a rebellion in eastern Jonglei, which destabilizes the area, which affects, unfortunately, a minority, the Mole population, and which makes it at this stage, this area, rather ungovernable. And these kind of problems, of course, impact on the landscape at large and the ability of development and humanitarian actors, but also private investors to come in. Now, there's the political security front. Then, of course, the economic crisis. I also already commented on that one. But this crisis, this fiscal economic crisis, exacerbates, of course, the underlying problems I have mentioned, I think, in my previous interview, the lack of infrastructure. There are only a couple of hundreds of kilometers of tar road in the entire country. There is very little infrastructure and energy, transport and water on any kind of IT systems. There is not a single fixed landline here. Everything is done through cell phones where they are available and where the companies have established networks. So this is pretty much work in progress, but of course undermined by the lack of domestic resources. And then you have something which is often underestimated, the social problems. We are still very much in a tribal society here, and during the decade-long war against the North, I mean, the common denominator of identity was, of course, fighting against Khartoum, against Islamization, against dominance by the Arabs, as they called it here. And now they have to develop an identity, national identity, a corporate project, which substitutes for the unifying factor of fighting against Khartoum or fighting against their former enemy. And that, of course, is a difficult one, because then you have to find a common denominator for the 60 tribes or so. You have to develop a social contract model which binds and glues them together behind a common agenda of development, a political project. And now the constitution still hasn't been adopted. There's a temporary constitution in place. That is work in progress. And of course, you have to ensure that everybody feels part of that process of being part of that new nation, which is South Sudan. This is, of course, a long process, and the social contract, as we know, can only be established once the citizen feels protected and respected in his or her rights, and once the state is able to deliver the services, not social services, but also basic infrastructure, and of course security, but also providing the means that accountability measures are in place and can be used by the citizen. This is the fourth impeding factor, because the fact that, of course, it's only 2 years that independence began, and the 7 preceding years where the CPA was signed in 2005, and where, of course, the government at that time of South Sudan developed some experience in running a civilian administration, was not long enough to actually ensure that at all layers of government, all the way from the top down to the state and county levels, you have the necessary capacity. And of course, a huge challenge would be, but also a huge potential would be, to incorporate the impressive diaspora which exists and which so far hasn't come in masses. I mean, there are so many well-trained South Sudanese who lived during the war in the States, in the UK, in Canada, and Australia, well-trained people who would love to come back, but they would find it difficult in the current environment, because job opportunities are not abound. The private sector so far cannot absorb many people. The regulatory environment is not properly developed, and of course one has to be very frank as well that the top layers of government are given to those who ensure a maximum stability at political level, meaning tribal and provincial and military allegiances are an overriding concern, and that an administration will have to be formed which is more based on merit than, of course, on these other factors, which of course are also important for social peace, but that needs to be balanced out against people who can actually do the job. And this is a project the government is quite aware of and critical about its own limitations, but this is a long project, and money in the short term will not help, and also TA in the short term will not help. I think we have to find a balance whereby we help the government addressing key issues which deliver social services and which provide them with better policy. At the same time, the government has to make provisions in its own budget, in its own structures, to set aside people that can be trained over years. And that is something which will take years. And the donors have to accept that. They have to say, even if you have lots of domestic revenues at one point in time, the skill development is something which takes much longer. So we may, over time, need less money in financial terms, but very well focused technical assistance in order to help the government on its ambitious development agenda. So I think these 4 factors together are major challenges, but also major opportunities, of course, and need to be addressed by the government and by the donor community.